this computer. Okay, who had a question? Somebody had a question.
Me. Have you posted the previous recordings?
I have not posted them yet because they are huge. They are enormous, and I got to put them up on YouTube because they won't go on Blackboard because they're too big. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna I'll put them on YouTube, and then I'll put a link up to the recording. So, but thank you for asking that, Abraham. Do you go
Yes.
by Abe or Abraham?
Just Abraham.
Okay, Ibrahim. All right, so let's see. Where was I? Oh yeah, sharing a screen. Um, share. So anyway, getting back to this guy, right? So the axon hillock, the signal that travels down the axon, the signal that does travel down the axon is referred to as an action potential. Action potential. It's a weird name. It's a strange word. Don't worry about where it comes from. It's got a long history, but it's like it's hard to explain. Um, and then there are these little sausages of fat that are wrapped around the axon. They insulate it so that the signal can travel quicker. A lot of the magic happens at the end of the axon terminal. And if you recall, um, we looked at the end of the axon terminal. The end of the axon terminal actually comes very close to touching the other neuron that it's communicating with, the neuron next door. And here is a little diagram of that. Let me show you that real quick. Boink. And let's view image. And then let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's see. There we go. So here's kind of a close up, right? So here we have one neuron sending an action potential down the axon, gets down to the synapse, and then we have this receiving neuron here, and it's got its dendrites, out in space, listening for shit, right? It's listening. And if you get a close up of where these two guys are actually coming in closest contact, this is a cartoon version. But basically, what we have here is the sending neuron and the receiving neuron. And what you'll notice is there's nothing in between. There's a space in between. They're not actually touching each other. So the question becomes, how do they communicate? Well, the sending neuron, when the action potential signal reaches the very end, that electrical event causes these little bubbles. Just imagine these as little round bubbles to move forward and pop. And what they do is they pop and they release their contents. And their contents are chemicals. Their contents are chemicals called neurotransmitters. Okay, neurotransmitters. And those chemicals travel across this gap, and this gap is known as a synaptic gap. Travels across the synaptic gap, and then they connect with or bind to these big, gigantic protein molecules that are sticking out from the surface of the other neuron. These giant protein molecules are called receptors because they receive, right? They're receptors. And as soon as that binding happens, as soon as the little neurotransmitter comes and kisses the neuroreceptor and sticks to it, this receptor changes its shape and it does something. And typically what it does is it changes its shape and that allows ions to flow into and out of the cell, causing a small electrical change here. Sure enough, if enough of those small electrical changes happen in this cell, then it will fire an action potential and the process continues. Okay? So all the magic is right here with these neurotransmitters connecting to these receptors. After the receptor is done, after it's done its job, it's, wham bam, thank you, ma'am. The receptor lets go of the neurotransmitter. And then the neurotransmitter goes back up into this transporter. This is another big protein molecule. It goes back into this transporter and it gets sent back up to be recycled. Okay? So action potential causes the synaptic, these are called vesicles. These little bubbles are called vesicles. If you ever have a British professor, he or she will say vesicles, which is kind of cute. But these vesicles are move forward and pop with an action potential. They release their neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter binds to the receptor. The receptor receives this binding and it changes its shape and it does whatever it's going to do on the other side. And then the neurotransmitter is released. It gets sucked back in through this uptake site. It's called an uptake site. And then it gets recycled, repackaged into another vesicle, and ready for another deployment. Okay, so that's basically fundamentally how neuronal transmission and neuronal communication work, right? Um, one of the things about the action potential. One of the things about the action potential. Let me see if I can first show you an image and then show you a video because it helps to see a video sometimes. So an action potential, it's a big spike that travels down the length of the axon, right? It's a big, oh, I thought I found a cool picture here, but I guess I didn't. Oh, there it is. It's a big spike that travels down the length of the axon, right? And basically, here's the thing, right? The axon, if you think of the axon, actually the whole neuron, think of the whole neuron as kind of just like a round bubble, right? The inside of the bubble, the inside of the bubble is negatively charged compared to the outside of the bubble. So it's like a battery. It's like a battery. You know how there's a negative and a positive on a battery? Well, each one of your neurons is exactly like that. The inside of your neuron is negative because there's a lot of negative ions in there, like chloride ions. And the outside of the neuron is positive, meaning that there's a lot of positive ions out there, like sodium ions and potassium ions. Now, that difference in where the negative is on the inside and the positive is on the outside is maintained by something called a sodium potassium pump. Let me show that to you real quick. Let's see. This one might work. I think this one's a good one. This is the sodium. Now imagine these right here. This thing right here is a giant protein that is in the membrane of or in the wall of the neuron. And this is the outside of the neuron, and this is the inside of the neuron. Here's the membrane or the wall. And this is the way the sodium potassium pump works.
Active transport is a type of cell transport that requires the input of energy in the form of ATP.
Hang on a sec. Let me see if I can get the audio. You guys probably didn't hear the audio, did you? Let's see.
I hear it. It's just slow.
Oh, did you hear the audio?
Yeah, it's just slow.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, all right. So
the proteins that conduct this form of transport are often called pumps because they force molecules or ions to move from an area of low concentration.
So this is a pump here, right? And basically, what this little pump does is it keeps the positive out and the negative in, right? That's its job, right? It maintains this negative charge inside the cell, right?
To an area of high concentration. This is commonly referred to as against the concentration gradient. One of the more common examples of active transport is the sodium-potassium pump.
Sodium-potassium pump.
The job of the sodium-potassium pump is to move sodium ions, or Na+, out of the cell, and potassium ions, or K+, into the cell.
Yep.
Let's take a closer look at how this happens. The sodium-potassium pump has binding sites to three.
So now what you're going to do is you're going to see how this pump actually does its thing, how it's pumping out ions, bringing some out and bringing some in.
Into potassium ions. Let's follow the movement of the sodium ions first. After 3 sodium ions are positioned within the carrier protein, an ATP molecule is split, releasing phosphate. This phosphate binds to a location on the exterior of the carrier protein, causing the protein to change shape. As the protein changes shape, the three sodium ions are released to the other side of the membrane. Next, two potassium ions position themselves within the carrier protein, causing it to undergo another change in shape. In the process, the phosphate molecule is released. Once the phosphate molecule is released, the carrier protein expels the potassium ions into the interior of the cell. The carrier then resumes its initial shape, completing the cycle. Notice that for every three.
Now that's pretty cool. You have to admit that's pretty cool, right? You've got billions of these little pumps that are maintaining this balance, right? That are maintaining this negativity inside your neurons and your positivity outside your neurons. And the reason this is important is because the action potential is actually when this polarity flips. Okay, the action potential is actually oops, did I have that picture? Let's see. View image. Yeah, there we go. So the action potential is basically so here is your cell at rest, right? So those ions, those positive ions are sitting on the outside, and those negative ions are sitting on the inside. And that little pump is there, doing its thing, keeping that going, right? So that's just at rest when the cell is just chilling, it's not doing anything, right? And you can actually take a little tiny glass electrodes, tiny little microscopic electrodes. You can actually measure the voltage, just like you measure the voltage on a battery. You can measure the voltage of your neurons, and that voltage is about negative 70 millivolts when the cell is at rest. When it's just resting, the difference between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell is negative 70 millivolts. But when an action potential happens, all of these little gates open up, all of these ion gates open up, and all of a sudden, all of this positive ions flow into the cell and negative ions flow out of the cell. And this is called depolarization. Depolarization, meaning that the neuron is like reversing the flow, right? Very suddenly. Once all of the ions that are outside rushed in and all the ions that are inside have rushed out, it stops, and then the little pumps take over, and they slowly repolarize the cell and get it back to its resting state. You can think of it like flushing a toilet. The toilet's just sitting there. You come along and take a crap, and then you flush the toilet, and the water leaves the tank, and then it takes a while for that tank to fill up again, right, before you can flush the toilet again. And during this time, when the cell is repolarizing, when those little pumps are trying to get things back, to the negative on the inside and the positive on the outside, the cell really can't do much. Um, but all of this takes place in just milliseconds, very quick milliseconds. But that that potential change of ions flowing in and out of the cell, that's the actual electrical event. That's the action potential that hops. This signal hops. This happens at each point on the axon, and that's the electrical event that makes its way down to the axon terminal that causes those little vesicles to move forward and pop, releasing their neurotransmitters. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the different neurotransmitters that are actually out there. Let's see. Let me find There's a listing here in your book, a nice little table of different neurotransmitters. Now, there's not just one neurotransmitter, right? There's a whole bunch of them. And this table here gives you some of the major neurotransmitters. There's actually back when I was sitting in your chair in 1982 at the University of Texas, there was I think there was only like, I don't know, 15 neurotransmitters known, some stupid number like that. Now there's like thousands. Now we have discovered thousands of neurotransmitters. But these are the big ones. These are the big guys, right? One of the most important neurotransmitters for behavior, actually, they're all important for behavior, but one of the ones that you hear a lot about is called dopamine. How many of you heard of dopamine? How many of you heard that word dopamine? Have you heard that word? Yeah. Yeah, it's so what dopamine is, it's a neurotransmitter that is released again, just like I showed you, right? Now, dopamine is located primarily or manufactured primarily in the lower parts of the brain, and then those cells that make dopamine send their axons forward to the forward parts of the brain through these long bundles of axons, and those axons terminate at forward parts of the brain. Let me see if I can show you that real quick. So let's see if I can find some dopamine pathways here. No pictures. No pictures. We need pictures. Images. Let's go to images. Find a good one here. Oh yeah, here's a good one. Here's a nice picture of a nice cartoon drawing of. So the little cells that make dopamine are here in the substantia nigra. This little dot here is the substantia nigra, right there. The ventral tegmental area, the VTA, and then those neurons, or I'm sorry, those axons get sent forward, right, into the front part of your brain here. This is, by the way, a half view of the brain. So if I took my brain and cut it in half, right, sliced it in half, and then took it and showed you the inside surface of the half, that's what you're looking at. So this is like the half of the brain here. This is the front of the brain. This is your top of the head here. This is the back of your head. Your eyeball, one of the eyeballs would be right about here, right? So it projects over here and into what's called a striatum. Now, here's the thing about dopamine. It does a lot. It does a lot of things, right? It's involved in a lot of things. One of the amazing things that dopamine is involved in is in reward. Reward, making you feel really good. Okay. Think of the things that you do that are just very pleasant feeling, right? Of course, the number one at the top of the list is sex, right? That's awesome, right? Sex is awesome. It feels good, right? Um, and the act of doing sex and the act of having an orgasm, right, involves the dopamine pathways lighting up and activating to allow you to experience the pleasure. Think of how good it feels to drink. Have you ever been like super, 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 super thirsty? Like really thirsty, and you drink water, and that water tastes so, and cold water especially, right? And it tastes so good, right? And it feels good, right? Well, again, that's activation of the dopamine sort of to make you feel good. Have you ever had to take a huge, massive shit? And you just and you're like, and you just got it, and then you take that massive shit and it just feels amazing. You're like, oh my god, that felt so good. Right? You're sitting there on the toilet going, I'm gonna have an orgasm from taking this massive shit, right? um Again, that's, your dopamine system activating and telling you whatever you're doing is good for you, right? There's ways to activate the dopamine system through behaviors, right? So, for example, people that are addicted to things like gambling or pornography or sex can are act or part of what they're doing, not entirely, but part of what they're doing is activating their dopamine systems that way. Another way to activate your dopamine system is through drugs, which we'll talk about later in the semester when we get to altered states of consciousness. But drugs like cocaine, for example, cocaine is a wonderful dopamine activator. It does a really good job of completely activating all of your dopamine pleasure centers. Another drug that activates dopamine pleasure centers is uh, amphetamines, like meth. That's why these drugs are so addictive, is because they directly activate your pleasure centers in your brain. Dopamine is also involved in controlling your movement. Dopamine is also involved in the disease of schizophrenia. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of schizophrenia. We're going to talk about schizophrenia later when we get to when we talk about mental disorders. But schizophrenia is a serious mental condition. It's a serious psychosis, basically. Where you're separated from reality, and you're sort of living in your own little world. um, that has an underlying cause of basic that is related to dopamine, which we'll talk about later. Um, Another famous neurotransmitter, another one of my favorite neurotransmitters, is serotonin. Serotonin, right here. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that is critically involved, just like dopamine, in regulating things like mood and sleep. Some of you, if you've ever heard of some of the drugs for depression, you ever heard of Prozac? You ever Prozac or Paxil? These all these drugs that are prescribed for depression and anxiety. All of these drugs that are prescribed for depression and anxiety nowadays, what they do is they activate serotonin. And we'll talk later on in the semester about how that works. But these drugs activate serotonin, so they increase the amount of serotonin that you have in your brain. In general, increasing the amount of serotonin that you have in your brain puts you in a better mood. It makes you more relaxed, less afraid. So that's why these drugs for treating depression and anxiety are so effective. Basically, is because they work on serotonin.
Mm.
Acetylcholine, acetylcholine, right here. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that gets squirted out from the motor neurons. In other words, the neurons that are controlling your muscles. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that gets squirted out from your motor neurons onto your muscles. Okay, so there's what's called a neuromuscular junction, where the neuron comes and the little axon terminals are sitting there connected to a little tiny part of the muscle, and that muscle has receptors, acetylcholine receptors, that are sitting there waiting for the neuron to squirt acetylcholine onto it. Uh, whenever the motor neuron uh, releases acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine binds to the receptors on the muscle contracts. And when the acetylcholine is released, the muscle relaxes. And then that's the way we are able to flex our muscles and control our muscles, is through the use of acetylcholine being released by our motor neurons. What do you think would happen if you block those acetylcholine receptors? What if I gave you a drug to block acetylcholine receptors in your muscles? What effect would that have on you?
Maybe you wouldn't have good, I guess, recollection.
No, acetylcholine. Well, I'm talking about about the muscle action of acetylcholine. If I were to block the acetylcholine receptors on your muscles, right?
Then you
Wouldn't
wouldn't.
you get a cramp?
Say again.
Wouldn't you get a cramp?
Oh, worse than that. Worse than that. You'd be paralyzed. Yeah, you would be completely paralyzed. You wouldn't be able to move because, think about it, the acetylcholine's getting squirted out of that muscle, but I gave you a drug that blocks that receptor, that's sitting on top of that receptor, so it's unable to be activated by the acetylcholine. This is in fact what the drug curare does. It actually paralyzes human beings, and of course when you're paralyzed, you also suffocate, because we use striated muscles and acetylcholine to breathe. So if and it turns out that there are certain venomous snakes that use this type of venom to kill their prey. They will bite the prey, and they'll release acetylcholine blockers into the blood of their prey, and the prey will get paralyzed and won't be able to move. If you ever go into general surgery and you're completely anesthetized, well, one of the things that the anesthesiologist does is he gives you an acetylcholine blocker to paralyze you, and that's why they have to put you on the respirator when you're having major surgery. Because your lungs don't work anymore because the muscles are paralyzed. So they put you on the respirator, and they have to paralyze you because even though you're asleep, people that are not paralyzed will be like flinching around whenever the doctor's cutting around in there. They don't want you to do that, right? So they paralyze you so you don't move around. Um, beta endorphins. Beta endorphins. How many of you guys have heard of morphine? You ever heard of morphine? Yeah, morphine or a related drug to morphine is heroin, and then you can get synthetic morphine nowadays in Percocets, or those pills that people sell, the pain pills that people sell, right? Well, those drugs like morphine work by binding to receptors in our brains that are specially made for drugs like morphine. They're called opiate drugs like morphine and heroin are called opiates. Believe it or not, we have in our brains receptors for opiates. And we also have neurotransmitters that act like opiates. So those neurotransmitters get released partially in response to a pleasurable sensation, right? Like sex or whatever, right? But beta endorphins also get released when we're in a lot of pain. Uh, so if you get, if you get injured or get shot or whatever, right? Or if you're giving birth to a child, it's a big one, right? One of the things that your brain does to help you when you're experiencing all that pain is to release beta endorphins into your brain and binding to those opiate receptors in your brain to reduce the pain that you're feeling. So there's all this discussion here of all these different neurotransmitters. So take a look at that. Any questions so far about neurotransmitters or neuronal transmission or?
Two questions actually.
Sure.
First off, how will you be testing us on these? Like,
Absolutely.
what does what?
Absolutely. You're going to get multiple choice tests based on all of the content that is in this book.
You got it. So
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
pay attention to the
Yep.
neurotransmitter.
Yeah. Or
Uh,
read the book. Or read the book very carefully. It helps to read the book very carefully and pay attention. So.
I plan to do both, sir.
Yeah. Yeah.
And second question: is it possible for too much serotonin to kill you?
No, no, that's a good question. No, no, yeah. So there's Prozac. For example, Prozac is the classic drug that increases the serotonin in your brain, and it's almost impossible to die of a Prozac overdose. People have tried. Basically, what does is it makes you extremely drowsy, also very ill. You also get really sick, like nauseous, but it doesn't kill you. So,
All right.
yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So, anybody else? Any other questions? Miss Stetler looks very bored, but that's okay. So, all right. So now let's go to the next section. Let's talk about the now. So we just finished covering like at a very microscopic level, right? We talked about neurons. We talked about how they talk to each other. We talked about action potentials, and we talked about neurotransmitters, all these little tiny things, right? Little tiny molecules. So now let's go big. Okay, let's go big now and talk about the parts of the nervous system. Okay, the different parts of the nervous system. Oh, I hate this. I wish it would just let me make that smaller. And let me go next. And so now we're going to talk about the different parts of the nervous system as they're presented here in your textbook. And we have first of all, we have the two big parts of the nervous system. Okay, we have the two big parts of the nervous system. namely hang on a sec. There we go. A little bit better to see. Namely the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, the central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, you kind of need that shit. Okay, if you ain't got that stuff, you ain't nobody, right? You got to have a brain and you got to have a spinal cord. Okay, the central nervous system is obviously very important to making us who we are. The central nervous system is wrapped in protective bone, right? So your brain is encased inside of your rock hard head, right? And your spinal cord is encased in a series of vertebrae that run up and down your back. So it's well protected. It's also covered in membranes, very tough membranes. Um, the central nervous system also has something called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier, which means that it keeps out a lot of nasty chemicals. Not all chemicals, obviously. For example, alcohol, as found in beer. Obviously, that passes right through, right? If it did, you wouldn't be able to have a good time with beer, right? But there's other things that don't pass through the blood-brain barrier and protect the brain from disease. Um, the other part of the main nervous system of your body is the peripheral nervous system, and that's basically all of the other nerves that you have in your body. All of these nerves originate from the spinal cord, and they come out through exits in the sides of your vertebral column, and they go out and innervate all of your body so that you can move your body, and you can also have sensations of different stimuli like heat, cold, rough, smooth, etc. sensations that you feel throughout your body. So we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is broken up into the brain and the spinal cord. That's easy. The peripheral nervous system is broken up into itself is broken up into two separate parts. So this is the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is made up itself of two separate parts: the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Now, think of a little animal out in the forest, right? So think of this little cute animal out in the forest, right? Little big brown eyes and cute fur. It's like a bunny, right? Like think of a cute little bunny out in the forest, right? When the bunny is out in the forest, right? When the bunny is out in the forest and he's hopping around and he's eating, right? He's pretty relaxed. He's eating. There's nothing around. Uh, his heart rate is nice and low. He's not sweating. He's not breathing hard. His guts are working to digest his little bunny food that he's eating, right? So he's got that situation going on. Then all of a sudden, a big wild dog appears, and the bunny, looks up and smells the dog. Well, what do you think is going to happen to that bunny, right? That bunny's going to get scared, right? All of a sudden, his heart rate is going to go up. He's going to start sweating. I don't know if bunnies sweat, but let's just pretend they do. He's going to start sweating. He's going to start breathing faster. He's going to release a bunch of adrenaline, to get that extra boost of strength. His eyes are going to get dilated. They're going to get bigger so he can see what's going on. And his lungs are going to dilate so that they can breathe and move more air so that he could get the fuck out of there, right? So he could run or fight or do whatever he's going to do. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are the parts of our nervous systems that control those two separate states, whether you're relaxed and chill and eating and fucking, or whether you're scared and heart pumping and running and screaming, right? The parasympathetic nervous system is the one that controls when you're chill and relaxed, okay? So whenever the parasympathetic nervous system is running things, it's activated. Your pupil, the little hole in your eye where the light goes in, it gets constricted, so it goes small. You're able to salivate. I don't know if any of you have ever been really nervous before, like if you had to speak in front of a big crowd or something, and your mouth went dry. I don't know if you've ever experienced that before, but that's one of the reasons why. That's the reason your mouth went dry, is because the fear, the anxiety activated your sympathetic nervous system. But when your parasympathetic nervous system is activated, you can salivate. Your parasympathetic nervous system slows your heart down so that you're not burning up too much energy. It also constricts the little tubes in your lungs, the bronchi in your lungs, so that you can conserve some energy in breathing. It also gets your guts working. The sympathetic nervous system gets your guts working as well as your sexual organs, right? Your ability to have an orgasm and do all of the wet squishy things that we do in sex, right? That's all controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. And it also causes the bladder to contract. So the parasympathetic nervous system is what helps you take a piss, right? Whenever you release release pee, it pumps it out, right? And it also gets your guts working. That's all happening when you're relaxed. And the whole idea of the parasympathetic nervous system, that can be summed up in three famous words: rest, digest, and reproduce. Rest, digest, and reproduce. That's basically the three things that the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge of. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in whenever you encounter some sort of threat or something that causes anxiety. So it causes your pupils to dilate, to get bigger. You ever seen that happen with cats? Like Puss in Boots with the big pupils, right? Dilation of the pupils. Your mouth goes dry, so you can't salivate anymore. Your heart rate starts beating faster because you need to carry more oxygen and food to your muscles to be able to deal with whatever threat you're facing. Your bronchi and your lungs get bigger; they get dilated so you can move more oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of your body. Your guts shut down. Your guts stop digesting while you're in this state of anxiety or nervousness or fear. And your bladder is inhibited from contracting. So for momentarily, you really, you don't feel like peeing momentarily uh, during the time which you're scared, or the bladder just stops working completely, and you just release whatever pee you may have. That's why sometimes animals and people will pee when they're afraid, right? Because the bladder is just it's not being controlled anymore, so it just releases its pee. I don't know if you've ever heard of if this has ever happened to you, if you've ever been about to do something scary and then you throw up. I don't know if you've ever seen that before or heard of that before. It does happen. And the reason that happens is because, before you do the scary thing, you have food in your gut. So it's sitting there, right? And it's being digested. But then you're about to do something scary. So your sympathetic nervous system takes over and it shuts down your gut. So since your gut is shut down, all of that half digested food is just sitting there in your stomach, just festering. And eventually your stomach says, okay, I need to get rid of this. So you turn over and bah, puke it all out, right? So that's the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. Remember that they are part of the peripheral nervous system, which is this one here, the peripheral nervous system. And let's see. Now the spinal cord is actually that part of you. Whoops, is actually that part of your brain that is, or that part of your central nervous system that is down your back inside your vertebrae. And let's see if I can find a nice picture of the human spinal cord. Yeah, this one's not bad. Let me see if this will work. Whoops. Oh gosh, I hate these. Accept all cookies. Yes, whatever. Okay, so here we go. So let's view image. And so here's the image. Let me make this a little bigger. Boing, boing, boing. So right here in the middle, we have your brain, right? So this is a cartoon picture of a brain. So this is the front of this is your forehead right here. This is the back of your head, side of your head. So your ears are right about here. Your eyeballs are right about here. And notice that the going coming out from the bottom of the brain and then going into the spinal column is this long spinal cord. And a human spinal cord is, really only a couple of feet long. They look longer in pictures, but they're really only a couple of feet long. um, we're segmented. We as a species, we come from the same We come from a group of organisms called chordates or chordata. And one of the things about chordates is that we're segmented. Our bodies are broken up into segments, just like worms. And you can see that segmentation in the spinal cord. Each one of these segments controls a different layer of the body. So you'll notice here that the segment that's coming out, that the doctors refer to as C4. C4 covers that part of the body there. C5 that part of the body, and you see all the segments going all the way down. This is how back doctors are really able to diagnose where you have a back injury based on what part of your body is being affected, what part of your body is numb or you can't move. They can zero it down to exactly where along your back um, the injury is. And then at the bottom of the spinal cord, you have all these nerves that come out through the bottom, and then those are the ones that go into your ass and your legs, all the way down to your feet. This is a close up here, a slice of your spinal cord right here, and you have the little neurons that send their messages out through these through the motor route, the motor route. Then you have the little sensory route, which sensations come in through here. Of course, if you get a spinal injury, a severe spinal injury that cuts the spinal cord at some level, that means you're going to be paralyzed from that level on down, which is not a good injury to have. But that's your spinal cord. The brain itself. Let me see. This is the one. Welcome to the brain. So, skip intro. So here's a nice little cartoon picture of the brain, right? And so this is a human brain. So, hi there, kids. I'm Brainy the Brain. I'm going to explain to you how the brain works today. Nobody's laughing. Okay. Oh, okay. So here's a brain. I can rotate it around. So right now the brain is looking at you dead on, right? Now the brain is looking off to the side. So your forehead is here, the back of your head is here, and then the brain's going to turn and look to the other side, right? Now, one of the things you'll notice about the brain is that it's made up of two halves that are like mirror images of each other. So you have this half and that half, right? Each one of these halves is referred to as a hemisphere. So this is the left hemisphere, and this is the right hemisphere. Okay. And you'll notice that the brain is all wrinkled. You notice that you have these wrinkles, these hills and valleys, right? Uh, the the uh, the hills are called a gyrus or gyri, and the little valleys are called a sulcus or a sulci, right? And the reason our brains are so folded like this, and they're folded like this, right? They're packed, is so that we can pack in as much brain into our skulls as possible. Otherwise our skulls would be this big, right? So in order to reduce the size of our brain, it's packed in like this. Small animals like rats and cats, they have smooth brains, right? They don't have a lot of folding brains. More smarter animals like dolphins and gorillas, they have folded brains like we do, but it's not. They don't have as big a brain as we do, but they are folded. Um, One of the things that you have to understand about the brain is that there is what's called lateralization. In other words, lateralization means off to one side. Okay. And that means that there is certain functions of the brain that are controlled by one side of the brain. So for example, all of the movements of the left side of your body are controlled by the right side of the brain. So this right hemisphere here controls the movements of your left side of your body, and the left hemisphere here controls movements and sensations, by the way, of the right side of the body. Nobody knows why that is. We don't know why that happens. It's just that's just the way it is. Um, the the other part, the other thing too about the lateralization is that one of the things that's lateralized in humans is language. Our ability to speak, read, and write a particular language is lateralized. So if you're a right-handed person by nature, if you're naturally right-handed, then the left side of your brain is your language part of your brain. And then if you're a right-handed person, it's the opposite. The left side of your brain is the language part of your brain. So that's kind of cool, right? Um, the big folded part here, the big with all the creases on it, is called the cortex. Cortex, the cortex. And the cortex is broken up into different lobes. So let me see if I can find the lobes here. Structure isolation. I accept. What does this do? Oh, it's going to let me find the lobes. No, it's not going to let me find the lobes. Let me see if I can find a good picture of the lobes for you here. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I know, I know. Okay. Where is that? Oh, here it is. Boink. That's what I was looking for. Run Adobe Flash. I don't know why they still use Flash, but whatever. 3D brain. 3D brain. Hello. All right. So here's another picture of the brain, right? And what we have here is it's got colors on it now, so that you can see the different lobes. Okay. So the big red one here in the front is called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe. A lot of important thinking goes on there. We humans use our frontal lobes for advanced planning, higher level thinking, right? The lobe right behind the frontal lobe is this kind of greenish one here. By the way, they're not really this color. This is just to illustrate. This is called the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe. The parietal lobe holds a lot of what are called association areas that link together different information. And it also holds lots of areas that control our motor movements, the movements of our hands particularly, right? Kind of underneath the parietal lobe, right here in the back of your head, is the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is where your vision centers lives, the part of your cortex that interprets visual information. So there's actually columns of neurons in these in the occipital lobe that are responsible for detecting shadows and straight lines and curved lines and angles, and we can actually detect those here in the occipital lobe, and that's part of the mechanism that allows us to see. And then this thing here hanging off to the side is what's called the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, if you look at it in 3D, if you kind of look at it from the front, you can see it's kind of, it's kind of like the thumb and on a boxing glove, kind of. But that's the temporal lobe. Remember the story I told you about HM, the guy who had the brain surgery and he couldn't remember anything new? Well, his epilepsy originated in his temporal lobes, and that's what they removed from him, and that's what unfortunately also removed the hippocampus, which was inside of his temporal lobes, right? If we go in a little bit, like so. Oh, let me rotate this a little bit more. If we turn around here, we can see through one of the hemispheres, and now we can see inside what's underneath in 3D, which is kind of neat. And this guy that's kind of curving around like this and going into the temporal lobe, I don't know how well you can see that, but that is actually the hippocampus right there. And that's what poor HM had removed from him when he had his surgery. Let me show you. Let's go to, let's take a look at the hippocampus and all of its friends. So here's the hippocampus and all its friends that are kind of organized in there. So the greenish thing that you see there is the hippocampus. You see we have two of them. There's one on each side. Those are the parts that poor HM had removed. The little blue dot right here, this little blue dot right here is called the amygdala. Amygdala is a Latin word for almond. It's because it looks like a little almond, I guess, when the early guys were dissecting people's brains. The amygdala is an incredibly important part of our brain. It is responsible, we think, for mediating our responses to fear, and threats. And it's also responsible for emotional responses, for sort of coloring our experience with emotion. So the amygdala is a very important part of our makeup. Right here, this little guy right here in the middle, it's called the hypothalamus. Let me rotate that around so you can see it from the front. So now we're looking at the brain from the front. There's the hypothalamus right there. It's in the middle of the brain, way down, way deep down. The hypothalamus is responsible for controlling a lot of our basic bodily functions, like temperature maintenance, heart rate, breathing, pain control. It works to control pain. It also controls the release of hormones, which we'll talk about later. But the hypothalamus is a very important part of our brain that controls all these basic functions. This is the part of the brain that I did research on when I was in graduate school a long time ago. Let's see. Let me show you okay, so that all those parts of the brain are called the limbic system. This big goofy part of the brain back here, right? Right there, hanging off the back of your, the back of your hindbrain, and it's colored in purple here. That is called the cerebellum. Now, back in the day, we used to think that the cerebellum was really just involved in controlling your motor movements, coordinating how smoothly you could move. But there's a lot of new research that's just come out just in the last 5 years that's telling us that the cerebellum does a lot more than that. We think it's critically involved in learning and memory, particularly learning and memory. It's a really important part of our learning and memory. It's also probably involved in our perception, the way we perceive things like vision and hearing. So it turns out the cerebellum probably does quite a lot. We're just now learning more and more about it. So that's your cerebellum. Let's look at your brain stem. Let's go way down into the brain and look at your brain stem. Okay, so this is your brain stem, okay? If you've ever heard of sometimes you hear these stories about these babies that are quote unquote born without a brain. I don't know if you ever heard of that before. Uh, it's obviously a horrible a horrible defect. Most of those babies are stillborn, or if they do live, they only live a few hours after birth. But what typically happens in those situations is that they're only born with this part of their brain here, the midbrain, and they're lacking pretty much everything else that you see here. Now, the midbrain is an extremely old, evolutionarily old part of the brain. Um, this is the same. This brain is the midbrain of very primitive creatures like amphibians is very similar to our midbrain. The midbrain is broken up into the midbrain itself, the pons right here, and the medulla. The midbrain does a lot of control of very basic functions. Like, for example, there are centers in your midbrain that control breathing. There's centers in your midbrain that control heart rate and blood pressure. They control ion concentrations and digestion, all sorts of things. These little bumps here that you see in the back, these two little bumps on the top are called the superior colliculi, and these are little bottom ones are called the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi, these two little guys right here, in humans, well, I guess in all mammals, but they are partially involved in controlling the movement of your eyeballs. So each of your eyeballs has six muscles that controls how it moves, and these little guys are responsible for helping your eyes target their proper location. The inferior colliculi, these two little bumps down here, are responsible for helping you to target and locate sounds. If you're an animal that has movable ears, like how kitty cats can move their ears back. You ever notice that? They can move their ears back or they can move their ears forward. They use their little colliculi to help focus their ears on things that they want to listen to, right? So one more thing. Let's see. So we did the limbic system. Uh, oh, the corpus. Yeah, the corpus callosum. Now, remember how I told you that the brain, our human brain, is basically broken up into two halves, right? Two halves. Now, here's the thing. Those two halves have to work together. They have to talk to each other. And the way they communicate back and forth is through this bundle of cables right here. It's a bundle of axons, millions and millions of axons. And this bundle of axons that exists between the two halves of the brain is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. That is a corpus callosum is a Latin term which means big body, and there it is right there. Um, in some cases where if you have a person that has a very severe epilepsy that begins on one side of their cortex, either on this side or on this side, one of the things that surgeons will do sometimes if they can't treat that epilepsy any other way with drugs is they will actually go in and cut the corpus callosum. They will split the brain so that epilepsy seizure, which begins either here or here, cannot spread to the entire brain. That's like a last ditch approach, but there are many patients that have had this done. And the strange thing about it is that once they've had this done, they have some very weird behaviors. Sometimes these people will be trying to get dressed, and the left hand will be buttoning their shirt, and the right hand will be unbuttoning their shirt because they're not coordinated together. If I show you a picture in one eye, in the eye that is connected to the language center, um, I'll be able to tell you what it is that I saw. I can say what it is that I saw. But if I shoot you a picture in the other eye that's not connected to a language center, you'll be able to see it, but you won't be able to tell me what you saw. You won't be able to recognize it because, again, the corpus callosum has been cut, and that visual information can't travel across to the language center to say, hey, you're looking at a picture of a house or a boat, right? So there's a lot of very interesting phenomenon that result as that have been observed as a result of cutting the corpus callosum in these severe epilepsy patients. All right, so that's all for tonight. I think we're done. So I will wrap it up there. We'll pick it up there on I guess Tuesday. Tuesday, since Monday's a holiday, so I'll see you on Tuesday. Okay.
All
So
right.
y'all have a good y'all have a good weekend.
Bye, Dr. Lopez.
See you later.
Oh, I do not know if I